Hello, I am Phil Cornish. I'm your host for Cornish Talks Common Sense. We've got another program for you today. And as usual, I've got a subject that is challenging, one that can be hard to get a hold of by its very nature and essence. And that's a subject that I'm going to call our self-delusion or self-deception that we are prone to as human beings in our thinking. This is a subject, though, that has great importance in our world that ought not to be underestimated. Let's come back and talk about that in just a minute. Welcome back. So, as I've just suggested, I want to talk today about the subject of self-delusion or self-deception. And you might say to yourself, well, where does that come from? Well, you've probably heard it said by me before, as well as others, that we're living in a postmodern world. And a postmodern world is really a post-truth world because truth no longer is an objective commodity. Now there is no idea that, for example, the Word of God, the Bible, prescribes precepts that are true and valid and always distinguishable from falsehood. That concept has been diminished and cast aside, shuttled off into oblivion by our modern academic elite world that has no time or place for God. I have a number of books on that subject. I have one at home, I think, by A.N. Wilson, I think, called God's Funeral, which again just talks about God being shuttled aside and out of the minds of people in our world today. And so it's important to understand that since the advent of postmodernism, one of the themes I've talked to you about many times, truth is now subjective. You've got your own right to your own truth, and truth is what you believe it is. There's no more objective component to it. There's no plumb line that can any longer tell us what constitutes truth once the Bible is rejected. So it is an important concept to understand because we are so prone to deluding ourselves, not recognizing truth. And I have some books with me that talk a little bit about that, just to make this point. So I have a book with me called The Death of Truth. So there you have it laid right out, by an author, Mikako Kakutani, who wrote this book about the death of truth. I have another book called Telling the Truth About History by three historians who look at the examination of how truth is discerned through history. And then I have a book as well with me today called The Self-Delusion by author Bruce Hood that goes into this very concept of self-delusion and the illusions that we are prone to creating with our own brains. I have a book I didn't bring with me today at home called The User Illusion by an author, Danish author, Noren Tranders, who talks about, again, this idea of how our brains are prone to delude us. And I have a number of other books by an author, Alfred Mell, who is one of the primary authors about the whole idea about human deception and how we're prone to doing just that. And then in a more practical context, I have another book with me today called The Harmony of Illusions by a McGill professor, Ellen Young, with the subtitle to his book called Inventing Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder. And on an earlier program that I talked about the field of psychiatry, you heard me speak about his book, talking about how the whole notion of post-traumatic stress disorder has largely been created out of thin air by our psychiatric purveyors of thinking that has generated concepts of disorders in our DSM manuals that feed into the idea that how you feel about yourself and the experience of trauma is now going to be viewed through the psychiatric lens in a way that says that, look, this is okay to feel that way, and having trauma is something that is governed by how you feel about yourself. And if you feel badly about yourself, that's bad, and you shouldn't view yourself through that lens. And so what we see is there is actually a lot of harm that can be created because of that way of thinking, instead of actually getting at the root of what's happening in our human psyches and behavior. So delusion, self-delusion. Let's just talk about that, because why is it so difficult to understand what is happening today in our modern world? Why wars occur? Why government seems to be so ineffectual? Why crime occurs, and violence, and moral confusion, and gender confusion? Why do these things happen? And we have a great difficulty of explaining it and understanding it unless we look through the lens that I've been promoting in our programming. And so there is an answer to the question. And we're going to explore that in our program today in an effort to understand why our world exists in the way it does. So to do that, we first have to look again to the Bible, and to understand why our world today thinks the way it does about issues that are occurring. And so I want to reference to you the second book of Thessalonians and chapter 2 and verses 10 to 12, where it talks about that mankind, because they've turned away from God, God will turn them over to self-delusion. Okay, those verses talk about man falling into self-delusion because they don't want truth. They don't want truth. And that passage tells us squarely why that has happened. Because mankind, through secular humanists and other means, has devalued God and shuttled God aside. So in doing so then, man wants to create its own pathway to how do we deal with climate change? How do we deal with subjects like gender dysphoria and abortion and drug addiction and homelessness and mental health issues and our saturation of our society with entertainment, being consumed by entertainment, and then also something as simple as marital decline. All those things are no longer looked at through the lens of morality, through a paradigm that sees God as the author of morality, and instead we fall into this morass of thinking based on our own self-delusion, which has been dictated to us very predominantly by people like Paul Kurtz that I've mentioned to you. And I have another article with me today from the Spectator publication in England by an author, Martin Rosen, who says, if God proved he existed, I still wouldn't believe in him. And so this is exactly the kind of attitude and ideology that's perpetuated by those like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and simply cast aside the notion of God as being valid at all. So you have to understand that kind of thinking in order to fully grasp what's happening in our world today. So this explains why we have a world where you don't view God as being part of it. So the abandonment of eschatology, how we're governed by our feelings and feelings giving rise to self-delusion, and postmodernism, where we have no singularly objective value system. Your own truth is whatever you want it to be. So then another notion I introduced previously is then we have the diminishing of sin. Sin is diminished because because after all, what's wrong anymore? I mean, everything is justifiable, everything is right. So I have an article with me called, "Has the notion of sin been lost?" And the answer is, yes, it has. Because all wrong and evaluation of what is right or not has been exploded and simply has been sent to the dustbin along with the idea of the notion of sin. Instead now, we make a mistake or we make an error, if it's even characterized that benignly, but certainly any notion of sin has evaporated. And we know this is an issue because in another article I have today, it was on CNN, why your brain can't always make good decisions. And it goes through explaining why as humans we're so good at fooling ourselves, why we're so good at generating delusion and deception in our own minds. And there's been ample studying on that, and I have quite a lot of that material too by people like Daniel Kahneman, who have written about how easy it is to manipulate human thinking and how prone we are to be misguided and to make misjudgments. And if you don't understand how our consciousness, how the mind functions, and how we're prone to self-deception and delusion, you will not understand this concept. So I hope I've helped to introduce you to that in a way that will be more meaningful. And I have one other article that I'll point to just at the moment as well. And this is an article from the New York Times I copied indicating study finds false stories travel way faster than truth. And so he's pointing out that fake news and lies are far more prone to be propagated and accepted by people than truth is. So self-deception and delusion govern substantially in our world today. And we see this battle in the news media all the time today of fake news and how falsehood is so prevalent. And indeed, it's true because people are prone to self-deception. So we need to grapple with and understand what is at the root of this. And so I'm suggesting to you displacing God from our lives, displacing objective truth and the determination of how morals exist, the moral code and values as espoused by the Bible, the Ten Commandments, for example. All of these things today are largely just shuttled aside, and we don't view the Ten Commandments as anything more than 10 suggestions, and even more than that, the 10 things that we can ignore with no consequence. Well, unfortunately, it's not as simple as that. So we're prone to lie to ourselves and to delude ourselves when it's useful for our own aims and our own goals. Another book on that topic is called Useful Delusions by Shankar Vedantam, who also wrote about that subject. So there's ample evidence and ample studies in support on this topic. So what we find then is that we are prone effectively to mental illness, to self-delusion and mental illness that has confused our thinking. And so feelings become more important rather than critical evaluation and critical analysis. And we see, for example, then that the World Health Organization says that there are 280 million people existing in the world right now who are suffering from depression, and others suffering, millions suffering from disordered thinking by virtue of psychosis and schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. And all those things are growing exponentially in our world today. So there's ample evidence of how our society is becoming mentally ill. And so this is in turn engendering problems of how we see growing homelessness. Stories from San Francisco, but not just there, from Chicago and all places over North America, where homelessness is growing, fed by mental health and by drug addiction, both of which are completely interrelated and connected. So the growth of disordered thinking is happening at an exponential level in our society and in our world today. And I'm going to suggest to you that these are all symptoms of degrading thinking arising from our proneness to self-delusion, exactly as the Bible tells us in 2 Thessalonians 2, where it talks about people being prone to following self-delusion because they have no desire to follow truth as is espoused by God. So I want to take you to at least one example today of how this is being displayed in our world. So I have an example that will be almost too much for you, frankly, to believe. But it's a story that I became aware of and have an article on from a newspaper probably as long ago as near 20 years ago. So I have an article with me I'm going to take time just to talk about. The headline of the story is "Former Doctor Guilty of Murder After Cutting Off Fetishist Healthy Leg." Someone who had a fetish that is called apotemnophilia. And what is that? That is a sexual desire to have a limb, one of your bodily limbs, removed. And so this particular person, a doctor by the name of John Brown, cut off and amputated a limb, a leg, a healthy leg of a patient named Philip Bondi. And that person ultimately died of gangrene because of that amputation. Because of this fallacious, flawed mental illness of this condition where a person is sexually aroused by actually having themselves dismembered, having a limb removed from your body. Now, this might seem unbelievable and almost impossible to realize that that concept even exists, but I can assure you it is scientifically diagnosed condition psychiatrically in the DSM manual. And so one would have to think, how does someone become so mentally disordered to be in that circumstance and condition? And I have another article on the same topic with me. This one is entitled "Sawing Off a Limb, Putting It in Dry Ice to Force Amputation, a professor studying people who feel like they should be disabled." So there's this mental health condition where people believe to be normal or in a sound condition, they need to literally have a healthy limb amputated. This is a real thing. And we see how this is also played out. Another article I have is by a man named Vinny O, a person who has gone to great lengths to change his body. By all sorts of surgery that he spent $150,000 on 100 skin and facial operations to change his look. And in fact, he's the one, you may have seen his photo, the person who frankly looks like an alien. The photo I'm showing up will show you how this person has, by plastic surgery, made himself out to effectively become what he would perceive as an alien. And so again, this is the kind of discordant thinking, the disordered thinking that is happening. You might have heard me reference in a past program we had of the person who, he was on the front page of New York Magazine, who a female person who had an operation to insert from thigh muscles a phallus, a penis that was inserted under his skin in his body to become a male person instead of female. And this kind of thing is becoming normalized. And so we see now this whole idea of transgender surgery that is now front and center in our society, and transgenderism in that whole area. And so there is much that could be said on this topic, and I've talked about some of it before with the idea of transgenderism. And I have studies, some with me here today, that talk about the connection between this kind of mental health disorder I've been describing and transgenderism, and there is scientific diagnoses of interrelationships of transgenderism and the whole concept of this non-binary view, which has kind of worked its way out of the blue, starting with some authors I've talked to you about before, psychologists and psychiatrists like Robert Stoller and John Money, who have created the concept of gender identity and trying to displace the idea of binary gendery, and the headway like a juggernaut that's unleashed in recent times. And there are studies, and I have them with me, psychiatrically, that describe how persons who often have suffered sexual abuse in their youth and have become disordered in their thinking and have invoked this transgenderism and again, by psychiatric disorder, have displayed symptoms that are based on underlying psychiatric conditions. So if we do not understand what is behind transgenderism and this idea that would have seemed so extreme in the past, and even the idea of amputating a limb is probably not seen as so disordered any longer when you have people who change their gender and undergo sex change surgery that does a very similar thing, amputating body parts or attempting to enjoin body parts. This is the kind of disordered thinking that is now gaining huge sway in our society. In a prior program, I told you about another example of the Belgian woman who thought she was a rooster, a mental health condition where she literally thought she was a rooster. Children today who are now thinking that they are animals. And so we need to just come to grips with this kind of disordered thinking that is gripping, and especially children today. There's no other explanation for the increase of transgenderism and the tendency towards lesbian behavior and so on that is escalating at rates that obviously could not be accounted for by any birth-generated action, but in fact is faddish and behavior generated by social contagion that exists in our world today. So all of this are examples of the kinds of self-delusion that exist in our society. We need to know about this, talk about this, understand what's happening, because our society is becoming a disordered society that operates under self-deception. We need to confront this. I hope you will think about it because of this program. Thank you for listening today.